Welcome back! If this is your first time here, I recommend listening to the earlier parts of this story so the journey will be clear to you. And for those who return each night, thank you for walking this path with us. Now, let the story continue.
Rain continued the work that men had left. It washed along the broken gate in slow sheets, ran the grooves of splintered timbers, and gathered ash into narrow, patient rivers that slid through the courtyard and found the old drains as if remembering. A route learned in calmer years. Smoke drifted in lazy veils where embers still argued with wet. Banners lay collapsed in their colors, crest and field merged into a single dark, silk taken down from height and pressed into mud until it learned the ground's grammar. The fortress had folded itself into low shapes, beams at rest, screens. Leaned as if listening to the floor, helmets turned upright to catch rain that fell through holes in the roof. Takeshi walked among these remains as one moves through a room that has forgotten its purpose. His steps were steady, unexaggerated, the solace of his sandals lifting and setting into blackened mud that took their weight and returned it with a small, even sigh. The straw hat bent under its load and shed a ring of drops that fell in a rhythm. The morning could count by. He did not seek, he did not avoid. His gaze moved the way rain does across stone, finding edges without insisting on names. The sword at his side kept its own quiet. The knot at his wrist remembered the work of a night and did not tighten behind him. Nobu followed close, the slight press of a younger weight testing the ground a heartbeat later. Smoke made the boy's outline soft and near, blurring his shoulders. Into the air, but his breath kept a clean thread, drawn through cloth, steadied, released. He looked with the eyes of someone who had learned a new alphabet over hours too long to measure. Broken arrow shafts lay like reeds in a winter river. A length of cord, cut and knotted, trailed from a post and slept in a loop. Half of a spearhead sat in a puddle, the rain raining it gently with circles that widened and vanished into other circles until the whole surface held nothing but sky. The Ronin who remained moved through the wreckage as shadows with tasks. One lifted a fallen shield from the doorway and leaned it against a wall where the wind could not use it for noise. Another knelt to straighten a plank so feet would not stumble where the hallway had narrowed to a strip of dry. A third spread a cloak over a shape that the rain had already begun to smooth. Hands careful but without ceremony, and set a bowl beside it the way the living give the dead something to do with their silence. Few words traveled. When they did, they were short and practical syllables that spoke to wood and rope and weather, not to glory dot from high on the remaining parapet. Crows circled and made the sounds that belonged to old roofs in wet mornings. Their black bodies crossed smoke and rain and were washed paler only when a white band of daylight opened in the cloud to the east. They were not messengers, they were attendants. Their calls fell with the same accuracy as drops into bowls along. The floor brief, exact, enough. Takeshi paused at the inner gate where the bar had rested for years and now lay in two. Clean links like a work divided into tasks. The cut faces of wood shone pale under rain and took on the sheen of new earth when wet. He set his palm on one length and felt the grain a story of seasons that had built the bar ring by ring, and of hands that had oiled it against weather, and of the 1 hour that had asked too much and been answered. He lifted his hand away and let the water erase that small print. Nobu watched and came nearer, his own hand hovering without touching, as if he could feel through bone the weight. Once held here and the weight let go, a piece of armor lay nearby, half buried in the mud, a black lamella torn from its cord and turned like a fallen scale. Rain made beads on its surface that gathered their small brightness and then slid off into the dark around it. Beyond, a broken banner pole leaned across a stone basin. The basin held ash-thick water where a single leaf floated and turned, touching the rim once each rotation, a clock that would not measure anything useful to men. Smoke from a collapsed gallery wandered across the courtyard, slow and uncertain, learned the draft of the open gate, and went out to the road as if it too were a traveler allowed to leave without question. The sound of water falling onto embers gave the morning its closest thing to music. Here a low hiss as a charred reed surrendered. There a sharper spit as pitch met rain and settled. Near the kitchens, a long, even whisper where a beam smoldered inside itself and practiced patience. Under all of it, the soft talk of rain on stone and mat. The old household conversation returned to duty after the uproar. He crossed to the outer yard. Footprints deep and shallow had made a map without borders. Wheel ruts held a black river, and in that moving stripe drifted the small wreckage of a night that would not remember itself. A snap tie of straw, a feather wetted into one blade, a sliver of lacquer that flashed once and became ordinary. Again, the flow slipped under the broken gate and took these things toward the road, toward the hill, toward the larger water he could not see. River of ghosts, he thought, not for souls, for fragments. Not for lament, for carrying. Nobu stepped to the edge of the runnel and watched a scrap of paper, the size of a prayer, ride the current. Ink had bled into a cloudy gray, leaving only a darker line where a brush had once turned to finish a character. The scrap turned and turned, then lodged, and the water made a lip around it before freeing it again. He did not put his hand to it. He stood and let the water keep what it had earned. Beyond the gate, the slope ran slick, grass bent low and obedient. The pines that had observed the siege kept their dark and their patience. They released droplets only when asked by wind. The road itself, churned by men and carts and hooves, had become a strip where mud wore the shine of use, and out there on that strip waited nothing that could be named victory. Takeshi considered that emptiness without surprise. He had seen rooms after storms. They were honest and could not be thanked for it. He turned back into the courtyard where the house had fallen, quiet around its own damage. A screen painted with cranes leaned against a pillar, its paper mottled from smoke and rain until the birds looked like river fog. Prayer slips in a corner shrine hung heavy and bled their ink in steady veins. One had slipped its tie and lay across the shrine's wooden lip like a tongue that did not wish to speak. He straightened the slip without thinking and tucked it beneath the rope where it would be held until it learned to be paper again. The survivors gathered at small fires, coaxed into life under tiles and fragments of Eve. Their flames were not proud. They worked a mow orange and were content to lick wet wood and make of it heat enough for hands and a little for tea. The hiss when rain found the coal was constant and uncomplaining. Bowls went from palm to palm with the economy of men who have measured hunger against the day's work. A ladle knocked once against the rim of a pot and made a modest sound that went nowhere and left nothing. Takeshi accepted no bowl. He stood near one of these small lights and let its heat brush his hands like a polite guest. Smoke from the fire braided with a larger smoke and drifted up along the pillar, collecting in a seam of the ceiling before slipping through a split and out. He watched the smoke lighten the house and leave it, and in that leaving heard the lesson that the morning had prepared, patience even in departure. Nobu's breath, so close, had become a rhythm that could be trusted. When the boy moved, it was to adjust his shield's angle so the rain ran off rather than pulled, to pull a mat straight so feet would not trip in moving, to set a fallen spear upright against a wall, as if teaching it not to sleep in mud. His hands had grown slower and more exact since night. Fear in him had learned a chair and sat when told. He carried not pride, but a humility that made his shoulders look steadier. In the far corner of the yard, where a gallery had collapsed into a polite heap rather than a spectacle, a rope had fallen and caught on a beam. At its end hung an iron ring the size of a man's palm, part of a bell frame, perhaps, or of some door's old discipline. The ring knocked gently when Wind asked, and answered the wind with a tone that sounded like a name spoken by someone who did not wish to disturb the sleeping. The tone came and went without claiming significance. It was enough that it was true. He crossed the yard again and passed the audience. Hall's open mouth, the room in which the storm within had taught him its vocabulary. The mats there had drunk their fill. Water made small roads down the lines, cut into the floor for a scribe's ease. A banner lay across the place where men once knelt to speak. Its folds had taken on the shape of the threshold. Through the broken shutters, lightning still flashed beyond the clouds, hemming, but farther. Away now. Thunder had gone to another valley and tried its voice there. On the far side of the hall, under a lintel spared by fire, an old broom leaned, its straw dark and matted. A hand whose had taken it up and set a path through ash to the door. A strip of carefulness that ended where the rain had claimed its proper sphere. Takeshi registered the path the way a body registers a scar upon the skin, not as wound, as memory. He let the broom stand where it was. There would be time enough for the tiding that belongs to the living. He went where the corridor narrowed and opened again onto the smaller garden. Water sheeted from the roof's broken edge and fell into a stone basin in a steady thread. The thread made a clear, bell-like sound each time it struck and renewed. Itself, a sound that could have been a prayer if it had belonged to anyone. The basin overflowed onto the flat stones and gave the garden a gentle map that changed by degrees. A single white feather lay stuck to the basin's lip. Rain had turned it to a blade. He looked at it and let it remain what it was, no omen. Only a thing that held light when the world was dark. Crows bickered above the keep and then fell silent, together as if remembering their own strictness. The smell of wet stone grew stronger here, clean and chalk cold, a counterpoint to char and pitch. It lifted something in his chest he could not call hope, and would not insult by calling grief. Perhaps it was simply air, new where there had not been any for hours. Beyond the garden, down the short stair to the storage yard, lay a scatter of torn armor and broken weapons half buried in the soft dirt and the soft earth. An iron tsuba, simple, held its circle of dark without rust yet. A length of bowstring limp had arranged itself into a knot that served no purpose and looked like a drawing of the day's confusion. A scabbard mouth, separated from its blade, filled with water until it spilled. He crouched and set the scabbard upright against the wall, not to preserve it, only to put one thing back into a recognizable order. Nobu did the same with a second, and the two made a narrow pair, straight as reeds after wind dotted the outer corner. Where stone met earth and earth had forgotten it owed the stone anything, a small fire smoldered under a tile lean-to. A ronin tended it with the care of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to warm water. He fed it twigs as if teaching a child to speak, each twig laid, never thrown. Each flame taken not for brightness, but for function. When rain reached in and pinched, he waited, then offered again. The water warmed and refused to boil. That refusal looked like peace from where Takeshi stood. He walked again and found the inner stair that rose to the wall walk. The steps were slick, water ran the grain in gleaming lines. He went up because the body sometimes needs a different horizon. The parapet gave the valley back to him in washed out plains, the river swollen and brown, the pines dark as confession, the road glistening, the slopes scarred with the tracks of men's urgency already half erased. The gate below was a mouth asked to speak too much and now content to be quiet. Beyond, the crows traced their circles and would not explain themselves. This was not triumph. The day had chosen the opposite of trumpets. It had taken the high sound from events and lowered them to a register the chest could carry for years. Without complaint, he listened there, above the yard's litter, and thought of Kazuo not as ghost, not as counsel, only as gravity, a weight that made steps honest, a direction that made maps unnecessary. In the breath between one drop and the next, he placed his brother in the space beside him where wind had its corner. And the space balanced out, he descended and returned through the hall, where the windows framed rain in narrow panels like scrolls. That would be read later. Nobu came with him, making the same choices without looking to verify them, his feet learning which plank lifted and which kept its oath. They passed the piles of gathered blades tied with cord and sat along a wall. The stacks of shields turned like bowls to let water run. The reed mats rung and rolled and left to wait. Men moved between these in the slow pattern of a house after a wake, the work that is not sorrow and is not joy, but proves both to be larger than appetite. At the broken gate, he paused again. The black water crossed the threshold and made its way along stone and soil, carrying cinders that shone as they spun, then dimmed, then shone again when a band of light opened in the cloud. A sliver of lacquer bobbed and sank, then caught against a splinter and stayed. Farther out, the runnel widened into a shallow channel that threaded the road and ran toward the river, the two finding each other by gravities. Old council. River of Ghosts, he thought again, and this time the name made no claim, because it needed none. Nob. You stood at his shoulder, and the boy's breath slowed until it matched the fall of water from the eaves draw. Release. Draw, release. His eyes moved over the yard and the fields beyond and seemed to learn where to land and where to rest. He lowered his hand from the scabbard's mouth and let the fingers open and close once, as if letting go of something that had served and might be needed again. Later, behind them, the fortress ruined and dignified both kept its scale. Rooms, whose paper had gone to pulp, still offered the shape of shelter. Beams that would be taken down and made into other useful things for other weather continued to hold up the morning, as if that too were a duty to be discharged quietly. The smell of charred wood and wet stone lay over everything like a cloth, spread for a meal that no one would eat. The cries of men had become the low exchange of work. The cries of crows, the only announcements the day respected. Takeshi stepped out under the broken gate and stood where the road began, rain falling on the brim and running off in obedient lines. He had nothing to present to the world that would call itself victory. What he had was a breath taken with care, a body that had remembered when to stand and when to wait, a blade that had stayed in its house while wood and water debated, a boy beside him who had learned to breathe in the right sighs. He let the road face him and asked it nothing. On the slope below, the black water that had gathered from ash and weather and the day's arguments continued its quiet drift toward the river. It carried not souls but proofs wood turned light, as leaf, a thread of cord that had known a grip, a shard of lacquer that had once reflected a face and now reflected only sky. The rain pressed every surface into something cleaner than before without pretending to heal. The valley kept its distances. The fortress behind exhaled its smoke with the respect a house shows to those who have left and to those who remain. Turned once more to look into the courtyard. A small figure, one of the men who had tended the hidden fire, lifted a kettle, poured, and set a bowl into someone's waiting hand. The hiss of water on ember replied. A crow on the highest stone shook its feathers to arrange the wet into something it could fly with, and then left the parapet without remark. The morning widened by a finger's width at the edge of cloud, and closed that distance again. Nothing. Hurried Takeshi stood where stone met road, and let his silence be a room into, which the day could enter without removing its shoes. Nobu stood with him, quiet made useful by use. Around them, the world spoke in its small ways, smoke drifting lazily through rain, the soft kiss of drops into bowls and puddles, the hiss of water finding ember, the far-off calling of crows, and the sum of those small speeches said more clearly than any cheer could have, the siege was over. The work of living had begun again, in a house changed and a valley that would carry its black river down to larger water and forget it, as rivers do. The torn armor and broken weapons settled deeper into mud with each minute, their edges occluded, their purposes removed, their metals returning by slow argument to earth. The banners, soaked and humbled, took on the weight of blankets laid over sleeping things. The hall behind them kept its echo and its emptiness, neither of which belonged to victory and both of which were correct. The rain wrote one more line, and one more beyond it. The day read only what it needed. He breathed. He stayed. He listened to the emptiness that follows a storm and learned its lesson again, that ruin can be honest, that silence can hold more than noise, that the road does not need a destination to be true. The river of ghosts slid away where no one would see it meet the larger flow. The crows spoke in their plain way and then left the walls. Nobu's breath matched the rain. Takeshi's silence answered the morning, and the morning, without praise or judgment, received it. Rain kept the fortress honest. It went on with its long patience, threading from broken eaves, beating along splintered beams, slipping down stone faces until they shone a darker gray. Smoke no longer rose with hunger. It drifted in thin, idle veils, a memory the morning could not be bothered to forget. The ground took it all, the water, the ash, the faint, metallic breath of burnt iron turning to blackened mud that held footprints for a moment, then softened them into formlessness. The siege was over, yet something like a watch continued. It lived in the rooms that had been emptied of voices, in the way the air tested itself for a sound that did not come, in the quiet corners where a presence could be felt only by its refusal to be found. Takeshi moved through this afterworld as if the rooms themselves asked him to pass gently. He stepped where matting still offered a path, where boards held, where a puddle's skin would not explode into noise. The brim of his hat gave off a narrow curtain of water that fell in front of him like a beaded door. He parted it with the same calm with which he had crossed through fire. His silence was not absence. It had weight, the gravity of thoughts trained to move without stirring dust. Nobu followed a half-pace behind and left, the place that had become the shape of his breathing. When he hesitated, it was not from fear of the house, but from an awareness that some thresholds belonged to others first. The smell of pitch, half-burned and resentful, curled along the corridors, where the flames had been forced to eat damp wood. Through the night, a bitter sweetness lingered, mixing with wet lacquer, wet rope, wet earth. In that mingling, he found the same unease that a man feels when he enters a room where an argument has been ended too soon. The walls held temper in their seams. They passed an arch where the plaster had cracked and fallen in a polite hush. Beneath the powder lay the first mark, a helmet, canted on its side, its crest snapped clean, the rim bitten and darkened by heat. On the crown, someone had etched fine lines, careful, exact, too precise to be the hurried graffiti of a siege. They curved and crossed like reeds in a winter pond, a pattern that hinted at meaning without offering it. Rain had found the grooves and brightened them. Each drop gathered light and then fell, sending the lines back into dullness. Nobu crouched, his breath shortening as if not to disturb the pattern. Takeshi did not touch the helmet. He looked at it until the eye had memorized what the hand would have learned, then let the rain hide it again. Beyond, a corridor opened and seemed to listen. Nobu's footsteps went ahead of him and returned soft echoes that did not want to be counted. The boy took his weight from heel to toe carefully. Even then, the house answered. His steps were the smallest announcement that life remained. From a stairwell to the left came a guttering light, the kind a tired flame gives when asked to do the work of a lamp in weather. Two Ronin warmed hands above it, their faces cut into white and black by the fire's weak courage. Their words were thin and close to the ground, carried as if in cupped palms. None, one said, and the syllable did not travel far. Not there, the other answered, as though the room itself might correct him if he named a place too loudly. Flame breathed, almost went out, then caught at a wedge of resin, hissed at the rain that had gathered at the edge of a tile, lived on. Armor found, the first went on, but he left the sentence unlit. The fire filled it with noise. The two men allowed the gap to remain, then stood as if standing could be an answer and moved away. Their shoulders wet, their backs taking the rest of the words with them. Takeshi watched the ember's red fix itself. To a cool and hold, watched rain find the rim and fall in a drop that shook the flame without mastering it. He passed on. Nobu drew nearer as if he could be learned by proximity. They entered the inner court where the rain fell straight and aspired to no drama. The paving stones were glossed as if lacquered anew. In their mirror lay the ragged mouth of cloud and the broken lattice of the hall. A thin black cord trailed from a beam and ended in a knot that belonged at a throat. The knot had been formed with the neat severity of one who expects to be unseen and yet enjoys doing a thing well. It dangled, emptied of its purpose, a gesture. Left behind, they turned under a gallery to the right and found what the rain had been patiently revealing. Grain by grain, a mask half buried at the edge of a shallow runnel, iron shaped into a demon mouth. Mud held most of it, but the lip and one tooth were free. Water dripped from a broken gutter above and tapped the tooth as if counting. The sound was small and exact, the kind of counting that a knight uses to keep itself from forgetting. The iron had gone dull under ash, but where the drop struck, it shone for a heartbeat, then dimmed, then shone again with the next patient touch. Nobu stopped. His hands rose, without knowing what to do with themselves. The demon's grin offered no opinion. Takeshi stood, the brim of his hat turning falling water into a circle around him. The faint smell of burnt iron lifted from the mask and joined the pitch and wet stone of the court. It was not a relic so much as a remaining. It did not declare victory or defeat. It made the air heavier by the size of a thought he did not reach. For it, he knew the temptation to lift such a thing and force it to declare its story. He had seen men make the mistake of interrogating objects. The truth was elsewhere. The mask, like rain, knew only repetition. It would count the day by drops and be counted by nothing. He watched a thread of water make a trail across its cheek, gather at the curl of the lip, fall, and begin again. A whisper passed along the far colonnade, two figures in soaked coats. One carrying a shield, no longer useful for anything but being carried. Their voices were so carefully thrown underhand that the house could hardly notice them. A body, one said. Not his, said the other. The first made a small sound, upon which no language has bothered to spend a word. They went on. Their torch showed a thin, unambitious flame guttering in the draught. Smoke from the wet cloth wound up and left them in a ribbon that looked like writing in a language they themselves could not read. Takeshi knelt, not to touch, to be at the level where the mask's presence could be felt as the ground feels it. He could hear more clearly the drop's small tap, the runnel's thin, steady rush, the whisper of rain striking stone and organizing itself into water. The demon mouth told him nothing he did not already know, but the mud around it told him where a body had not lain. No press of armor's weight, no drag of plates, no collapse of cords. Only the last gesture of a hand flinging the thing aside, or a current discovering it and persuading it to rest here. Master, Nobu said soft, a word that asked whether he was seeing correctly, not what he was seeing. The sound was the smallest permission. Nobu's breath steadied. He lowered himself and saw what Takeshi had seen in the mud, absence. He looked farther, searching for argument, and found only Rain correcting every story into the same sentence. They left the maskets counting. In the next hall, an armor stand had been thrown down, its wooden ribs splayed like a fish's. The lacing that once made plates into garment, lying in a puddle like a loosened spine. On the floor beside it, a charm had been dropped or placed. It was a rectangle of lacquered wood with a single character burned into it, too smudged by steam to be certain, something between endurance and silence. A cord passed through its top hole and had been cut with care rather than haste. Takeshi lifted the charm with 2 fingers, not to keep it, to remove it from water. He set it on the lintel where Rain did not reach. He did this much and no more dawed at. A foot of a stair that bent up into the keep. The floorboards bore a clean, pale scar where something heavy had been dragged and then lifted. The mark went for the length of 3 breaths and then stopped. Wood holds stories until water asks it to let go. This story had already been half erased. Takeshi counted the length with his eye, turned the count into the measure of a body, and let it go. Footsteps would lie before the day was over. Men have always been eager to give rooms the narrative's rooms do not require. They came at last to the gallery that looked upon the courtyard where the demon face had first been seen. Rain threaded it like a loom with a patient weaver. The parapets. Stones held beaded lines. The slots that watched the yard were blank. Here the air felt like a question that had been asked in the night and forgotten just at the moment an answer would have mattered. The smell of iron was stronger, not fresh, not rust. The scent of metal that has been heated enough to think about its own shape, and then cooled. Before making a new decision, Nobu's footsteps announced themselves, then apologized. They sounded too loud against pillars that remembered other sounds brush on paper. The indecisive creak of a chair that would not give, the careful cough of a clerk. Each step in this deserted brightness felt like a word spoken in a place that did not require words. He shortened them until they fit, until his weight moved like the weight of Rain Dot beyond the gallery. A small shed leaned against the inner wall, its door ajar. Inside, coils of rope lay in disciplined circles. Hooks hung on their pegs, each coated with a film of ash and damp, as if smoke had tried to make the iron its own, and the rain had obliged it by refusing to turn the film into grime. On a low shelf, a brush lay across a pot of pitch turned to a cloudy jelly. Someone had set the brush down carefully. That care was the loudest thing in the room. Takeshi looked on the shelf's far end. There, in dust made muddy by the breath of the morning, was the clear, precise absence of an object removed. A rectangle twice a hand's breadth had sat there long. The dust had grown around it patiently. When it was lifted, it left behind the shape of decision. Nobu saw it last. When he did, he felt the skin of his forearms tighten, as if the air had changed temperature and wished to warn him. He could not say what had rested there. He knew only that it had belonged to the man whose room this was, even if the man had never set a foot inside. Rain strengthened for a time and added its speech to everything. Torchlight along the far colonnade dulled and then steadied. A pair of survivors passed below, carrying a board between them upon which lay armor plates cleaned more carefully than the hour deserved. "No body," one said, and the words were a piece in a mosaic repeated under the breath at many fires. "None," the other agreed, weary not of searching, but of bringing the same syllables into air that refused to accept them. The rain took the words as it takes ash, turning them to minerals, then to soil, then to silence. Takeshi moved toward the inner hall where a long table had been dragged into a crooked angle by night. Papers lay plastered to the matting in soft fans. He peeled one gently free, not to read it, to free the mat from its weight. A kanji near the top, bled into surrender, kept the ghost of its intention duty. Perhaps or order 2 strokes still certain, the rest gone to sea. He set the paper upon the table and let water finish it. The room's corners had gathered. A mild chill. The smell of wet ink and cedar oil lived there, held apart from smoke, as if the two had agreed to share the morning. Without argument, Nobu reached for a door, left a hand's breadth open. He paused and looked to Takeshi. The older man inclined his head permission without investment. The boy slid the door aside with the care of one accepting an object in a shrine. Inside, a small writing room waited with the profound disorder that follows a disciplined mind's urgent departure. A brush lay with its hair toward the floor. A seal rested upside down. A sand tray had been knocked, and its grains drew a small desert across a line of instructions half written. On the wall hung a map in ink, its lines crisp. A single pin had been removed, leaving a naked hole. If absence can point, this one did. Nobu swallowed and let the door breathe closed again. His footsteps as he backed away reminded him of nights and temples, of moving so that his presence would not bruise the air. He joined Takeshi in the hall, and the two of them stood looking toward the broken windows and the soft falling day, as if waiting for weather to answer a question. What remained of the fortress had learned to compose itself. Fire no longer made sentences, rain no longer italicized them. All punctuation had come to rest at the ends of lines. Yet the mark they sought was an unending one. It lived anywhere a lamp had burned without smoke, in the precise way a knot had been cinched and cut, in a trail that began and then forgot its obligation to exist. Takeshi felt it in his chest like a weight hung from a thread. He did not test the thread. He let it hold him to the hour, a bell. In the far village, tried a single note and ran out of courage. The sound came thin through the ruin, crossed the courtyards, and grew honest only when it met water on stone. The ronin in the next hall shifted their fire and shaded it with a tile. No body, a voice reminded the coal, as if coal and rain together might be persuaded to confess. Then a shadow, another answered, not with belief, with fatigue. Silence reclaimed them like a blanket tugged up to the chin. They returned at last to the outer yard, to the runnel where the demon mask lay counting. Rain still touched the tooth and kept its careful tally. A crow stood on the wall's last intact corner and watched everything as if it had been paying attention since the clan's birth. Nobu saw a glint near the base of the wall, a sliver of black lacquer wedged where stone met earth, and pried it free. It was no more than a scale from a plate, light enough to float in the runnel if he allowed it. He did not. He set it on. A legend stepped back. He did not know why the lightness disturbed him. More than anything heavier, Takeshi stood with the weight of thought pinned quietly where it belonged. He knew the way the phantom could be more present by being unseen. He had known such men, those who filled a room with their refusal to fill it. The iron mouth on the parapet had been a face without person. Now the person moved without face. The house held both performances as if asked to keep the memory of a play when the actors had gone. He lifted his gaze along the wall to the place where lightning had once written the mask in white and let his eye find nothing. The nothing answered him, and that answer was more useful than the names men had begun to offer under their breath. The rain slackened briefly. Drops fell farther apart, larger, more distinct. Each one striking the mask's tooth seemed to speak a number in a language older than counting. The faint smell of iron rose and faded, rose and faded. Nobu shifted his weight and his sandals, made the smallest music against grit. His voice, when it came, was a thread. Will he be found? Takeshi did not answer with words. He looked from the mask to the mud, from the mud to the clean scars in the wood where the ram had written its logic, from those to the emptied frame of the gate. The trail the phantom had left was a perfection of refusals. No body where a body should be, a knot cut rather than torn. a stand careful in its fall, a shelf free of the thing that had once claimed it, a mask where a face had been. It was enough to be read in one sentence. Not yet. Nobu seemed to receive that sentence as if it had been spoken aloud. He set his palm on the scabbard's mouth and then lifted it away, embarrassed by the reflex. The air around them had a depth. That was not weather alone. It clung to stone the way smoke clings, without weight, with insistence. They went on along the inner wall, past another small fire where a man tended tea as if measuring patience by heat. They passed a doorway where a screen leaned like a man who has decided to stand in a storm rather than move away from it. They went through rooms that had become maps of water and ash. Everywhere, absence left its thin, exact trace, 2 steps that stopped short. A cup's ring printed once on a table and nowhere else. A splinter of black cord whose mate had gone. A thread caught in a hinge, not torn, simply forgotten. When they came back to the breach, the river of ghosts still gathered itself and slid outward, carrying quiet fragments toward the larger water. The demon mask remained in its patient mud, counting with every drop. The whispers around the torch had fallen to a long, practical hush. The fortress wore its smoke as a shawl it would not discard until the weather told it to. Takeshi stood and let the ruin arrange him. Nobu stood a heartbeat behind, listening with the whole body. No trumpet would name the end of this. The house had taught the morning how to carry a question in silence without setting it down or answering it. The phantom's mark was not the mask, not the helmet's reeds, not the lacquer sliver, not the cut cord. It was the meeting of all these threads braided into a rope that led out of sight and yet tugged at the hand that held it. Takeshi felt the tug. He did not pull. He accepted its presence the way one accepts a shadow at noon, surprising only to those who do not know how bright light makes. Darkness honest. Rain resumed its even hand. The crows shifted and settled. The Ronin by the guttering flame adjusted the tile and coaxed a little more life into their coal. Nobu's hesitant steps, leaving the courtyard, made their small echoes and were swallowed. Takeshi's silence moved with them, heavier than steel and more faithful. Behind them, the mask kept counting. Ahead, the road learned how to hold the absence of a man as if it were weight. The day, asked to carry what could not be seen, did not complain. It simply held its breath and went on. Dawn opened slowly, as if cautious of what it had to look upon. The clouds that had kept the siege company all night softened from iron to ash, then to a heavy, colorless wool. Light seeped rather than fell. It pushed through tattered gaps in the sky and found the land where it lay, furrows of trampled earth dark with rain, broken palings starved for straightness, carts appended and settling deeper by the hour. Smoke lifted in thin gray threads from scattered heaps, no longer the voice of fire, only its last breath. The crows that had circled the fortress now hung farther out, as if the field itself had become a kind of building whose roof they understood. Takeshi and Nobu left the breached gate and took the road that sloped toward the low fields. Rain came with them, rain without urgency, a steady workman's rhythm that gave the morning its measure. The road's skin had become a mirror for the sky. Each step made a circle that held a small universe for a moment and then forgot it. The smell of wet iron drifted from somewhere ahead, braided with mud and the faint, bitter trace of pitch that had followed them even after the fires had tired. Nobu breathed it and felt the body note it down, as if keeping accounts for a household he had not known he kept. They found signs of others long before they saw them. A strip of cloth snagged on a thorn hedge, the color drained to a lifeless green. A shallow print of a heel turned sideways as if the foot had thought better of its direction. A tin bowl half filled with rain, holding a floating sliver of ash like a black eyelid. Near a ditch, the earth was scuffed where someone had knelt, to drink from a puddle and gone away too quickly to finish the act. Takeshi's gaze paused at each trace and moved on without changing the pace of his feet. Nobu matched that pace, though his heartbeat kept its own. The hedges opened to a wide, low meadow whose grasses were pressed flat in long swaths, the marks of men lying down without sleep. Beyond it, near the ruin of a boundary wall, figures stirred, 4, then 5, then only 3 again when one lay back down and did not rise. They were men by posture, not by uniform coats of different makes, armor plates tied with cords of mismatched lengths, a shoulder sash faded to the color of wood ash. They had the look of stragglers, the body's economy returning after it has spent too long pretending to belong to an army. 2 crouched by a small fire that could not be kept alive in this weather, and yet was being asked to, their hands cupped around the suggestion of heat. Another stood and shifted his weight from foot to foot, as if trying to decide which foot belonged to the morning. When they saw Takeshi and Nobu, nothing heroic woke in them. Suspicion did, and the blunt, ordinary hunger that counts how many bowls might be in a stranger's pack. One reached for a blade that looked older than he was, and found the hilt reluctant in a grip that had learned to hold other things, rope. Stolen bread, children more often than steel. Another ran a thumb along the edge of a broken spear shaft as if to remind it of its purpose. The figure by the dead fire lifted his face and then lowered it again, a small surrender to the knowledge that the day would not change, simply because his eyes wished to be shut. Takeshi did not lengthen or shorten his stride. He did not remove his hat. He came to a halt where the ground held a little higher, and there he stood with the rain sliding from the brim in straight threads that drew a circle around his boots. Nobu stopped a pace behind and left, as he always did, and set his hand lightly on the scabbard's mouth, thumb finding the place it knew without looking. The air carried the clean sourness of wet iron more strongly now. The crows above commented once and then took their silence elsewhere. One of the men stepped out, a suddenness that belonged to his stomach more than to any plan. He had the gaunt face of someone who has been counting nights backward, trying to find the one where he might have chosen otherwise. Rain had pasted his hair to his temples. His eyes had in them the simple, indecent brightness of fear that has become too tired to be ashamed. He lifted a short, rusted blade that had forgotten the idea of sharpness, but had not been allowed to forget its use. He looked at Takeshi and saw the hat and the stillness beneath it, saw the calm of a man already listening to an hour he has entered many times, and something in him bucked. He turned to where it seemed possible to be right, the younger man with hands still learning their weight. He rushed. The word carries more speed than the body could find. What came forward was a stubborn, graceless urgency, the kind that hollows a chest without making it empty. Mud took his feet with a soft embrace and let them go too late. He lifted the blade with a motion learned from watching others and not yet owned by his bones. In the space that opened, Takeshi remained as he was. He did not lift a hand. He did not speak the name he might have spoken in another season breathe, but the habit of that word found Nobu's body anyway. The boy felt air move where a command was not. He drew a breath that was not deep and not shallow, a useful breath, and the hand that had been resting on the scabbard's mouth remembered its labor. The rasp of steel leaving, its sheath sounded larger than the field deserved. It had in it the dry honesty of a whetstone's verdict, the small birdsong of metal on wooden cord, the first syllable of a language the morning had postponed. Nobu's wrist learned again in an instant where the weight liked to sit. The blade came out into the wet light and did not announce itself. It was simply there. The man with the rusted blade came on. His mouth had settled into a shape that was not a snarl and not a plea, a shape the face takes when punishment and mercy are equally unlikely. His eyes were the mirror of Nobu's for that small moment. Fear, yes. Hunger, yes. The thin thread of duty that persists even when duty is no longer the correct word. Nobu saw himself in those eyes and saw the distance between them, a single step laid across by rain. He moved without elegance. Later, the body would remember fault lines, the small wasted motions that make shame in a craftsman. Now, the body did enough. His right foot slid. His left caught. His shoulders turned. The blade came up to meet the other blade, not to strike it aside, but to give it a path that did not end in him. Metal met metal with a tired, soft sound, as if both had wished to be something else. The rested edge glanced away and went on. Cutting only the rain dot asterisk, there was the smallest pause in which both breathed and neither owned the breath. Nobu stepped. Into that pause, the way one steps onto a narrow plank 1 foot, then the other, eyes forward. The blade in his hands found the space between the other man's arm and body, not as a plan, but as a result. It did what true things do. It brought a fact into the world and left the world to deal with it. It was not quick. It was not glorious. The act carried the imprecision of first times, the angle a degree too low, the wrist too stiff, the body not yet a single thing. The man's momentum confused the distance. The mud took a foot and then gave it back at the wrong moment. The air itself seemed to want to slow everything so that rain could count. In that slowness, Nobu felt the weight of his own hands as if they belonged to someone else and had been borrowed only for this 1 hour. The man's eyes, wide before, widened further, not in accusation, in recognition. He had found exactly what the morning offered, and it looked like him. His blade wobbled as if trying to find a new story to belong to. Finding none, it lowered in a small arc that rain divided into beats. He made a sound that was smaller than words and shorter than breath, the kind of sound a man makes when dropping a bowl he had not realized he liked. Nobu's body committed, completed the motion it had begun, still came back to where it felt it should be and then stopped because more would have been showing off. He held the hilt in both hands and discovered that his fingers were trembling in their own code, a message he could not bear to read. The blade hovered, water sliding along it in quick, straight lines, each drop deciding its own edge before falling. For a heartbeat that took the length of a life, the two looked into each other and saw the same animal put to different tasks. Fear was not an enemy there, it was a witness. In the man's eyes, Nobu saw winter mornings he had not lived, small altars with bowls he had not eaten from, a hand that had taught this rusted blade to be at least honest. In his own eyes, the man saw a boy watching himself become something that cannot be explained, except by standing in that exact rain. The man folded without drama, like a coat hung on a peg against a wall, no longer standing. Mud received him with the even courtesy it gives to everything. The rusted blade landed a short distance away and made a weak sound against stone, then lay as if surprised to be a thing again and not a purpose. Rain drew fresh lines on the ground and began its slow work of forgetting. The smell of iron rose, brief and unmistakable, then took its place among the other odors of a broken morning. Nobu's breath went ragged and then refused even that, stopping in his throat like a bird that has flown into a closed room and does not know the window is there. He opened his mouth and found no words. The air tasted of wet iron, sharp and clean and entirely undesired. He lowered the blade a finger's width and then raised it again because lowering felt like a lie. The world did not move to set him right. It waited with the patience of weather. The other stragglers did not rush in. One looked down at the man in the mud and rubbed his face as if trying to remove it. Another held up his hands, palms forward, showing their emptiness not out of honor but because they had nothing left to hold. The one at the dead fire picked at his failed ember as if it were an argument he wished to continue later. Their fear thinned into exhaustion. They stepped back, not out of respect, but because the morning had told them the tally for this field. And they were not in the correct column. Takeshi had not moved since the man's first step. The circle of rain around his boots continued, obedient, as if measuring time separately from the light. He watched the boy with the same attention he had given the fire at the gate and the smoke in the halls. There was no praise on his face, no rebuke. His silence was a room. In that room, the act lived where it had to live. Nothing else was invited. Nobu became aware of that silence as one becomes aware of a cloak around the shoulders once the wind drops. It did not warm him. It gave shape where there had been none. He lowered the blade slowly, careful not to turn the motion into theater, and brought it back toward the scabbard. The rasp of steel entering the wooden mouth was a small ceremony. It carried the same tones as when it had left, only now his hands shook against the sound. The blade hesitated just at the entrance, unwilling to accept the difference between the morning before and the morning after. He guided it in without looking down, remembering in time the angle that saved the mouth from wearing out early. Rain ran down his face in quick, cold tracks, collecting at his jaw before falling. He did not wipe them away. The water took the small, red stain from his knuckles and wrote it into the earth where it did not change the color of anything. The smell of iron dimmed. The smell of mud returned to dominance, honest and stupid and welcome. Somewhere behind them, a crow called once and was answered, the second call farther away, as if unwilling to be the echo of anything here. The men who remained slipped off to the side with the slow, hesitant tread of people leaving a room in which something fragile has been placed on a table. One turned and glanced back a quick, careless look that had nothing to fear and nothing to pity, and then vanished into the long grass that had been beaten down by a different kind of night. The field swallowed their shapes and gave back only the shiver of rain. Nobu Yu stood with his hand still on the scabbard's mouth, the thumb pressed to the wet leather as if testing whether it could feel. The weight in his wrists and shoulders registered the blade not as metal but as question. He had carried it across slopes and through halls, through smoke and under gates. He had trained with it and spoken to it without words when no one watched. He had imagined and rejected, and imagined again the hour that had just passed. None of the rooms in his mind had been this one. None of them this quiet. He looked down at the man in the mud. The face had gone to a kind of peace that did not ask for interpretation. Rain cleared it of expression one line at a time. Around it, the earth darkened in rings. The rusted blade lay where it had fallen. The edge turned to the sky like a question that had found the wrong person. Nobu's breath came back in a series of stumbles, the body negotiating with itself for something like rhythm. The chest answered, reluctantly, then obediently. He exhaled and felt the air leave him as if it were the weight, not the sword. Takeshi stepped forward at last, as if granted permission by the rain itself. He passed the man on the ground without looking at him longer. Then courtesy demanded. He stood near Nobu, not close enough to be shelter, close enough to be present. He did not touch the boy's shoulder. He did not tilt the hat to see his face. He let his silence hold the shape of both men and stopped it from collapsing. The field. Noticed none of us. Water traveled down the old furrows and became a thin black runnel that headed for the ditch. The ditch carried it toward the river that they could not see, but knew was there by the way the trees leaned and by the sound of distant water repeated in every puddle's mouth. The clouds rearranged themselves by imperceptible degrees, never offering color, only a different density of gray. The crows went on with their patient trudging of the sky. Nobu's hands, emptied of the first trembling, found a different shake, the tiny, invisible tremor that lives in a muscle after it has finished an hour it was not made for and will do again. He let the tremor be. He did not correct it into stillness. He did not ask it to leave. He breathed and felt his breath become a tool again. The smell of wet iron in his nose thinned to a memory that would return when called and would not when not. He learned in that small waiting how the body adds a room to itself for the things it now contains. They moved when the morning moved. The field allowed them to step around the man without forcing them to step over him. The mud took their prints and held them long enough to know they had been there, then lost interest. Nobu did not look back. He looked toward the line of broken hedges and the black sliver of the road that found its way between pools of sky. Takeshi walked beside him for 10 paces and then a half step behind, the arrangement of distance reforming without effort. No words came. If any had, they would have been too large. The only sounds that mattered were the rain washing the blood into the mud with slow, perfect patience and the distant cry of crows circling the broken land. The blade at Nobu's side felt heavier, not because of water, not because of anything. Men can weigh. He kept his hand near the knot and away from the hilt. The knot felt like a steadying band around the wrist, a reminder that cloth, not steel, joins one thing to another. They passed the low stone where moss had survived everything. They passed the cart with one wheel sunk to its axle, the spokes, holding water like a shallow wheel of bowls. They passed a field where the rice had been burned to stubble and now put up green that the rain encouraged without caring what had burned it. The world did not look away and did not stare. It carried as it always had and would continue to dot at the edge of the meadow, under a pine that had counted seasons for a century and would count this one as well. Nobu stopped. He put his palm against the trunk and felt the cool of living wood. It did not share his rhythm. It did not need to. He closed his eyes and saw the man's face not as judgment or as mercy, but simply as something that had been his to see. The tremor in his hand soft to a quiver that belonged more to rain than to muscle. He opened his eyes and drew his hand away, leaving no mark. Takeshi watched this with the same restraint he had shown the kill. He lifted his head to the line of crows and let the rain touch the exposed skin below the hat's brim. The boy would need no counsel today that words could provide. The counsel would be the road itself, the hours that followed, the way the blade would sit in its house, and the way the hand would sit on the knot without tightening. It would be the sound of steel leaving and returning, as necessary and as undesired as breath. They walked on. Behind them, the meadow folded its grass back into a memory of standing. The man's shape settled by degrees into the catalog of the day, and would be read only by those who know how to read. The rusted blade, left alone, filled with rain and looked less like a question and more like a bowl. The river waited where it always had, a little higher for the night's efforts, taking every black streak the fields offered and refusing to become anything but river. The crows called to one another and were answered, and their answering sounded like counting. Nobu did not become older as men count years. He became older in the way a house does when one wall is taken down and a room is made larger. He did not know yet what would fill the new space. He knew only that it existed and that it would never be empty again. He walked with that knowledge and with the soft, even patter of rain on his face, and with Takeshi's silence beside him, not a void, not approval, a presence that allowed the morning to say what it needed to say and nothing more. The road slid. Under their feet, the clouds stayed. The smell of wet iron and mud became air again. The world, which had been turned into a drum all night, kept time in smaller ways now. Drop, step, breath, crow. And if anyone had asked the valley what had happened here, it would have offered them only the quiet of water and the answer the river gives without speaking. It goes on. The road led downward until it could not be called a road anymore, only a dark ribbon of earth that had learned too much water. It ended where the land gave up its slight pride and let a wide river take the valley for its own. The river had swollen in the night. It ran broad and deliberate, bank to bank, a long body of moving dusk beneath a sky that had forgotten color. Rain fell in fine ranks and hissed where each drop met the surface, a constant quiet that stitched the current and the air together. Mist coiled low, pale and patient, spreading its thin hands over backwaters and reeds, holding the edges of things until they forgot their outlines and became part of a single. Breathing, Takeshi came to the verge and stopped. The last grass at the bank lay smoothed and shining, pressed by the feet of men and the weight of weather, and beyond it the dark water took everything the valley had given. Broken timbers, shattered armor, reeds torn from their beds and made into small rafts, a cart plank with a nail standing like a last word. And among these, faces turned upward, pale as the sky itself, drifting, their mouths filled with nothing but rain. The river received them without announcement. It kept its own counsel. It had carried greater burdens than this. Nobu hesitated. 2 paces back, as if the bank itself were a threshold witnessed by the dead. He looked past Takeshi's shoulder to where the water wrote its long sentence, never ending, never beginning, the line of words made of silt and branch and the sheen of wet iron. His breath found a shallow place. He tried a deeper one and found it heavy, damp with the river's smell, that mix of wet reeds and cold earth, and the faint metallic scent that lives in places where iron has met water without rage. He did not step closer yet. He watched the curtain as if it might turn and look back at him. The sound of the river was not roar and not murmur. It was the patient insistence of many small voices joined, reed against reed, water at stone, timber tapping timber in a dull exchange, the metal of a plate ringing a single tired note when it kissed another plate and then refusing to sing again. It spoke with the continuity of breath. The rain added its fine hiss, the kind a kettle makes when content rather than angry. Beyond these there was no sound that claimed attention. Even the crows along the far bank limited themselves to brief remarks, as if the river had asked them for quiet and they had agreed. Takeshi stood as if the river had called him by a name not used in years. His hat brim cast off thin threads of water that fell before his boots and joined the larger motion without ceremony. His shoulders held stillness with a craftsman's economy, not stiff, not lax. He was listening, not to words, to the rhythm of the world when it has been made to carry more than it should and still goes on. He felt the old names rise in him and sit without sound. Kazuo, spoken by rain only. Saori, spoken by mist. A vow whispered by a boy beneath a rock overhang. A mass that had refused to be only iron. The river did not answer to these. It answered to gravity and to wind, and in that answer he heard what he had come to hear. A pale face turned in the current, spun once, lodged briefly against a broken spar, and then freed itself in a slow, reluctant way, drifting on. Nobu's breath caught without his permission. It was not the face. It was the cloth at the throat, a sash he recognized, the faint ink of a crest blurred but still stubborn beneath the rain. He remembered it on a man who had laughed in the Ronins. Camp, laughter quiet but real, the kind given to soup in the dark when there is enough to share. The sash lifted with the current and then sank, then lifted once more as if making its last bow to the bank. He made a sound that lived only at the back of the mouth. Takeshi did not turn. He felt the young body at his shoulder bracket itself. Against what the river was willing to show, they stood long enough that time loosened its belt. The sky did not brighten, only reduced its burden by a degree, and the mist answered by fanning itself thinner. A breath softened into several, the edges of the opposite bank revealing a scatter of low willows holding to the mud. The waters. Skin changed with each gust. A wash of gray brushed into another shade of gray. Small ripples running counter to the current like messengers that know their news will not be believed. The hiss of rain on the surface never ceased. It drew a veil over everything, a sound that folded silence into itself rather than breaking it at the water's edge. Reeds bent their narrow backs and then stood again, patient as servants who have known better mornings. Their smell rose when rain pressed them, green and mineral and clean. Under it lived the metallic breath, the ghost of iron traveling where it pleased. The two scents braided into something like a story told by someone who has forgotten the names but knows the shape of things. Once there were men here, now there is water. And yet the men did not leave. A broken timbers raft came close and bumped the bank with a dull, hollow thud. The impact sent a small shiver up the wet sod, a simple traveling of force. On the raft, a breastplate lay face down, straps frayed and trailing, the once keen edge of its curve soft by soot. It moved away again, tapping the reeds as it went, and the reeds gave their soft complaint, a papery clatter, a whisper against lacquer that had given up being proud. On the far side, a sandbar that had not existed yesterday showed itself as a darker line under the water, a place where the current puckered and threw a fringe of small white over its lip. A face turned there, pale under the foam, hair spread like weed, and then passed into the deeper channel and vanished without drama. The river kept no account on the surface of what it had been handed. If it remembered, it was in its depth, where silt thickened and things went to the slow, cool work of becoming part of the valley again. Nobu edged a half step nearer, the grass sighing under his weight. The bank's skin gave a little and then recovered. His toes found the line where earth stopped and the river's breath began. He did not look to Takeshi for permission. He looked because he had to. Faces and fragments moved through a dream of gray, a hand open and honest as if asking for water. A wheel pin, a bow, its string slack, made into a narrow boat by accident. A scrap of blue cloth with a border of white that he recognized without wanting to the color of Kensei's household servants. Ordinary men with neat sleeves who had carried trays without spilling and moved like water in halls. He drew a breath that had edges and held it until it became round. "Listen," Takeshi said, not looking away from the current. The word was not instruction and not comfort. It was the only word the river would allow. No be you listened. The voices were not voices, and yet they were. The current sowed the hiss of rain into 1,000 whispered sibilants, as if reeds themselves had learned speech. Leaves touching water made soft answers. The dull thud of timber against timber wrote a low punctuation at intervals. Somewhere, upstream, a heavier thing knocked a stone and sent a deeper sound down the length of water, a traveling note that remembered bell and drum both. No single sound resembled speech. Together, they became a language the skin understood. He thought of the men whose faces he had seen in the fortress, the ones under cloaks at the small fires, the ones who had murmured, "None," and "Not here," the ones who had straightened a plank so feet would not stumble. He did not see their faces in the river to name them. He saw their weight. The water took it and made no complaint. For the first time since the siege ended, the boy understood that the valley had learned all their names and needed none of them. A branch came spinning, caught against a root, lifted, and freed itself, spinning again. It knocked another branch. The two traveled together for a time, then parted without decision. A shallow backwater held a film of ash that swirled in gentle circles. The ash had gathered into vague shapes like cranes and then forgotten them. It settled in a thin gray skin and tore itself again in the next breath. The world below the rain changed with the precision of a mind that does not hurry. Takeshi's stillness placed itself in the scene like another stone. He was not a figure asking the river for permission. He stood as if set there to accompany the water as witness, not as judge. The brim of his hat had taken on a curve from rain. Each drop rolled and fell from its edge with the exactness of a counted bead. The hand near the knot had relaxed without losing its purpose. When he exhaled, the mist closest to him laid back a fraction, as if to make a small space where memory could sit. He had known other rivers, thin winter ones that cut the fields with glass, summer ones whose shallows kept the voices of children, mountain ones that ran too fast for thought. But this was the river the valley offers after war. It told no stories of beginnings or ends. It arranged nothing to be remembered except the arrangement itself. He let Kazuo stand beside him within the space that mist had cleared. He did not ask his brother to speak. He allowed the fact of him to weigh the same as the water. In that balance, his silence found its labor. A pale scrap turned from the current and lodged against a rock 2 arm lengths out. It was cloth, the width of a man's hand, dyed the red that banners had taught the eye to notice and fear. The dye had faded to rust. It lay across the rock, as if resting. Nobu saw it and flinched, the breath inside him narrowing to a pin. He had tied just such a sash at the side of a man who had asked for no help and thanked him anyway. That man had told a joke about rain that had not been funny. Until later, Nobu made a small motion as if to step out and take it, then stopped. The river did not permit clinging. The scrap lifted in the next thin swell and slipped free, its color darkening as water wrote itself into the fiber, and then it joined the larger dark, suddenly not red at all dot mist slid in, then thinned, then gathered, hanging low and gray as eyelids. Its smell carried the clean bitterness that wet iron lends to air. Nobu tasted it on his tongue and thought of the rasp of his own blade leaving the sheath, a sound that was in him now, the way certain dreams remain, even when they cannot be told. The river did not argue with that memory. It made room for it that way it made room for everything else by moving. A log came down the center of the channel, long and straight, stripped of branches by the siege of water. It rolled over once with the dignity of an old animal turning in its sleep. The roll showed the pale belly of wood and then returned the dark back to the sky. The roll knocked against something just under the surface and sent a round of sound toward the bankload, full certain. Nobu felt it at the solace of his feet, Takeshi too. It was the kind of tone that a temple bell tries for, the kind it sometimes reaches only on cold mornings when the metal's patience is perfect. They did not bow. They kept their weight where it should be, on a snag where the bank had hollowed, a helmet had lodged, its crest snapped away, its crown filled with water. Each drop from the rain that struck its inside surface made a small, exact ring that widened and disappeared into itself. The rings had no memory of those before them. To watch them was to learn a lesson that could not be kept. Nobu watched until the lesson rose and faded, and then he looked away because the water would not let him hold it. A fisherman's skiff lay overturned farther along the bank, its hull pinned by reeds, its ribs catching threads of mist. It had the look of a creature asleep in the wrong place and waiting to wake in a story where it knew its lines. Near it, a line of footprints led to the water and stopped at the first shallow where someone had waded in to pull something, or someone to the edge. The prints had softened in the same unpersuaded mud that held everything. Takeshi considered them and gave them no more time than they deserved. The ordinary heroics of mourning are older than war. For a while, they said nothing and simply kept the river company. Then Takeshi stepped along the bank to where a low willow dipped its fingers into the current and shook them free. Again and again, a ritual without priest. He reached into the reeds and gathered one long, straight piece, green and wet, the smell, bright in his hand. He stood with it, not as offering and not as farewell. He held it because the hand sometimes needs a task when the eye has too much to teach it. And LB. You found a reed near his boot and did the same. The two stood, each with a wet green line in his hand, the reeds bending under the weight of rain and straightening. When asked, together they simply let the pieces go. The reeds drifted, knocked gently against one another, the soft click of living things, then separated, then came together again, then parted for good, each taking a slightly different seam. Of current, one slower, one sure. Nobu's eyes followed his until it was only the idea of a line, then only the knowledge that a line had once passed there. The river remembers. Nobu said, not to be answered. It carries, Takeshi replied, the two sentences not contradicting, not agreeing, simply sharing the air for a breath before the mist took them. A body came then near the shallows, turned by a wide gesture in the water, and faced them as if taking leave. The mouth was closed. The eyes had made their own arrangements long before. The current moved the hair across the brow in a way that made the face belong to no clan in every clan. Nobu stood his ground and did not look away. Takeshi inclined, his head by half a degree, not to the man, to the fact of him. The river accepted the gesture and did nothing with it. It moved on. Thunder had gone to the mountains. In its absence, the world sounded larger and nearer. The hiss of rain on the river grew intimate, a blanket a child might relax beneath. The dull thud of debris became the pulse. The wind slid along the water and lifted the topmost nap of the current, making it bright briefly, then dull again. The way breath brightens a cold window once and then loses its pinion. Everything repeated. Nothing repeated. On the near bank, reeds gathered into a little cove and then parted, forming a narrow gate. Nobu looked through it as into another room. Beyond, the current ran slower for a space, then sped again toward the bend where the river vanished behind willows and fell to a lower course. That bend was the place where things would leave their shapes and become something else without anyone's permission. He felt the warning in it, the way a dog feels weather long before the window darkens. It was not fear. It was instruction. Do not carry what the river is willing to carry for you. Do not ask it to carry what belongs to your hands, Takeshi's. Still figure at the bank looked carved from the same dark wood as the willow. Memory had made him heavy. The river, in its large economy, did not mind being asked to hold that weight for a time. He let it. He listened as a man listens in winter to the stove that has decided to speak in the language of coals. He placed, without drama, his brother beside him again within the space the mist kept for such placements. He placed it too, the mask that had smiled iron at the wall, the cut knot that had said not yet, the oath spoken in the storm that the morning had not revoked. The river acknowledged all these with its one answer. On, Nobu bowed once, not deep, not ritual, a courtesy to a house that has given shelter while he stood in its doorway and learned what doorways are. When he straightened, he saw, beyond the bend, a brief lifting of mist that showed for a heartbeat, a flat, pale island of light on the surface where the sky's gray was less gray. It vanished before he could name it. He did not try. He kept the image as a man keeps the taste of a tea he cannot find again, not in the tongue, in the hunger the taste leaves behind. Rain gathered on the brim of Takeshi's hat and fell in slow, heavy beads now. The hiss on the water soft accordingly, a finer veil spread over a coarser one. The mist thinned even lower, rolling across the current like breath across a mirror. Behind them, the land introduced itself, once more low fields, stubble, a line of stripped hedges, black water running in furrows toward the greater black. The fortress, somewhere behind all that, exhaled its last smoke and prepared to be ruin rather than place. The river did not turn to see it. Rivers do not turn. They stood until the first chill of long standing found their knees. Then Takeshi put his palm against the wet bark of the willow and took his hand away again, the smallest acknowledgement of shelter. He turned without speaking and began along the bank where the grass held the prints of those who had already come to witness and had left the witnessing behind. Nobu followed. The river moved with them for a while, matching its pace to theirs out of generosity, and then chose its own speed again as the bend took it. For a time the current ran just within their hearing, saying its thousand soft things, repeating, revising, forgetting, remembering. Then even that language faded behind willows and rain. The smell of wet reeds lingered longer, a green word held between teeth, then gone. The faint breath of iron stayed a little longer still, the ghost of an oath carried on mist, then surrendered to ordinary air. They walked, and the ground the edge of the world where water had been and would be, held their weight in quiet and gave it back and let them go. Night gathered without argument. It slid down the willows and folded itself into the reeds. It pressed a cool palm over the river until the water kept its voice to a low, continuous breath. The rain, which had worked all day with the patience of a scribe, loosened to a fine drizzle and then to a mist that did not fall so much as settle. The sky learned one pale opening where moonlight tested the valley and found it suitable. Through that opening, a silver, changing light laid itself on the current in thin strokes. As if painting in a language meant to be washed away by morning, Takeshi built a fire where the bank rose the height of a man's hand. He did not ask the river for permission. He set the fallen twigs as a quiet guest arranges his bowl upon another's table. The wood had learned water too well to burn with pride. It joined itself reluctantly to heat, then accepted its work. The flame never climbed. It lingered at the threshold of ember, breathing color more than light. The soft crackle of damp firewood filled the space with a small, even ceremony fiber, giving back the day in tiny sighs, the ash settling and then lifting again whenever. The breeze remembered the direction of the water. Nobu you slept near the willow's bend, cloak drawn over him, knees brought toward his chest as if to keep the day's images from slipping into the dark. His sleep had edges. He stirred like a man navigating a stream with his hands, palms out, trying to keep the current from taking more than it already had. From time to time, his breath caught, and the cloak rose and fell with quiet reluctance. He turned once and murmured, a word that belonged to no language spoken aloud, then settled, then moved again when a reed brushed his cheek. The river's mist thawed him a stone and laid itself across his shoulder. The night smelled green. Wet reeds gave their brightness. To the air, a clean, plant-bitter scent that widened the nostrils. Beneath it, scarcely there and yet present the way memory is present when one is asked not to think of it, lingered the faint fragrance of incense resinous, warm, without smoke. No stick burned at the fire, no ash cone rose. Yet the smell drifted into the clearing, clung to the grain of the willow, threaded itself into the damp fringes of Takeshi's sleeve. The fire made no complaint. It took the fragrance in as if meeting a relative it had never been introduced to and knew anyway. Moonlight, finding the one patient tear in the cloud, traveled down and broke upon the mist like a silver thread teased into many finer threads. It moved in small migrations, slipping from reed to water to the curved belly of a stone, then lifting back into the white that was not yet fog and not yet sky. The river took the light and wore it without jewelry. Where it touched the current, a seam brightened and wandered away like thought. Where it touched the fire's smoke, it made of it a soft cloth in which the night wrapped itself. Takeshi sat with his back to the willow and watched the seam of light drift over the dark. His hands were quiet upon his knees. He had no desire to coax meaning from the day. Meaning had found him, and he had not yet finished being still for it. The hand nearest the scabbard remembered, without touching, the knot that kept the blade obedient to the body. The other hand relaxed in its own weather, each finger accepting the cool air, as if it had been assigned to measure it. He heard her before he saw her. If hearing is the right word for a presence that touches the ear the way mist touches the skin, the sound was not footsteps. It was the act of absence announcing its intention to sit down. The reeds along the bank altered their small language, pausing between syllables long enough to make room. The fire breathed 3 times without crackle. The faint incense grew more certain, like a thought that had waited politely until invited and then crossed the threshold. Without raising its eyes, Sayori stepped into the light that was not exactly light. Smoke, lifting in layers from the low flame, gathered around her as a shawl that could not decide whether it wished to hide or to reveal. The moon, working through its one aperture, brushed her cheekbone and left a line that moved when she did, so that her face seemed cut from water, solid for a moment and then surrendered to ripple. She stood without weight. She stood as if the ground had learned her shape earlier that afternoon and kept it for this hour. Her eyes held the river, not the surface, the patience beneath. When she breathed, the mist learned to do so more gently. She looked toward Nobu and then past him, as if she could see the thing he carried arranged beside the thing he had become. The willow made no sound, yet its leaves straightened in the small wind with an attention one hears in temples when a bell is about to be struck. Takeshi neither rose nor bowed. His stillness made room for her, and his silence offered her a place. To place her words, bound, she said, and the word did not cut the air so much as thread it. Your path is bound. Her voice did not disturb the river. It took on the river's hiss, the delicate spill of water over the small stones near their feet. Each syllable seemed to arrive already damp, already softened by distance, as if spoken a long way from the mouth that shaped it. The incense deepened, warm and unreadable, as though the night had found the memory of a shrine within itself and set it burning. By blood, she continued, and though the cadence stayed calm, the weight in it settled like wet cloth. By vows taken and vows inherited, by the blade that sleeps to speak correctly. Nobu turned, small and abrupt as a bosie, bird beneath the cloak, then stilled. His fingers in sleep closed as if they held a reed and let it go. The fire, taking a new breath, insisted on one brief pop and then returned to its patient work. Moonlight slid from Sayori's shoulder to her hand and found there a pale gleam. That had nothing to do with metal. An echo of water borrowing the moon's face and slipping away with it, Takeshi did not ask which blood. He had learned the number of answers such a question can call into the room until the room cannot hold them and something breaks. He allowed the word to sit in him with the gravity that moves rivers toward their sea. He looked toward the seam of light where it threaded the current and considered how little light is required to make water speak of distance. Sayori's next words came from farther away, though she had not moved. You have walked the river that carries ghosts, she said. You have listened without naming. The river ahead is not of water. She paused. The mist pressed its soft cheek against the willow and withdrew. It is of consequence. The incense found the inner fold of Takeshi's sleeve and lingered there. The scent seemed to carry faint sweetness when the wind faced him, and a resinous sternness when the wind turned. It reminded him of the places where men kneel to learn silence that is not refusal. It reminded him of the lacquer that had lost its pride and discovered usefulness in the dark. He closed his eyes a moment, not in rejection of her, in acceptance of the room her words were making in him. To cross it, Sayori whispered, voice barely larger than the fire's own speech, sacrifice will be demanded. The word did not wound. It entered the clearing as rain enters a woven mat slowly, entirely, without leaving a drip to show where it has passed through. The river made a sound like pages being turned at a respectful pace. Nobu murmured again and lifted an arm, the cloak sliding, wrists pale in the moonlight. The vein there, a faint line, blue, like ink that has remembered its duty. He settled and drew the cloak up to his throat, breath naming itself with a small, even sound. He slept, but his sleep had learned the way of listening. What is given willingly, Sayori said, keeps its shape on the far bank. What is taken holds a shadow. She looked toward the bend where the water vanished into willow and reed, and fog, and beyond that into the dark that belonged to distance alone. Your silence has been a blade. It will be asked to be a bridge. A single coal in the fire turned and showed its bright interior. The damp wood, having yielded char all, evening at last found a line of fiber that wished to burn freely. It flared without standing up and then subsided, the light on Sayori's sleeve thinning to a shimmer that might have been only mist after all. The river hissed on the small stones, and in that sound her voice traveled cleanly, like thread passing. Through cloth without fraying it, you will come to a door without hinges, she whispered. It will open with a name. The name will not be yours. Takeshi felt the simple, heavy truth of that line find its place without argument. He sat, his palm on the ground beside him, where the damp had risen only a little, and let the coolness answer the heat in his chest. He did not ask which door. He had learned how doors appear only when the body is exactly where it must be, not when the mind walks ahead to meet them. The river of fate does not flood, Sayori went on. It deepens. It does not ask for haste. It waits in the body until the body is the bank. Her eyes returned to him, and the reflected moon in them looked like something spared from breaking. You will know it because your hands will be empty at the moment you most wish to hold. A small reed snake touched the fire's circle and changed its mind. Curving away with the economy of a line corrected by a deft hand, Nobu turned again, his face visible now beneath the cloak's edge. The boyhood in it softened but not lost, the days sitting at the corners of his mouth and refusing to leave. His breath shivered once and then steadied itself obediently, as if someone had placed a calming palm over his heart and counted. Sayori stood neither near nor far. The night kept changing her distance. One breath, she could have been standing within the smoke, the next beyond the willow, speaking through the silver that rode the mist. When she lifted a hand, the air accepted, the gesture as if it had been taught it in childhood. Her sleeve trailed no shadow. Bound by blood, she repeated, not as a chain laid upon him as an accounting. By the brother whose weight steadied your rooms. By the boy who walks half, a step and has learned how to stop. By the figure without a face who taught the wall what silence can do. The last sentence thinned into the river's own breath until it could hardly be said to belong to a mouth. Takeshi listened. And in his listening, there was the old practice that had made him useful and had spared him from noise that breaks men. The willow above him gave a quiet tremor, leaf against leaf. The fire accepted a drop and returned it as a small sigh. The incense decided to soften into the mist rather than stand its ground. He left his hands where they were. He let the word. Sacrifice remain untouched, neither polished by denial nor dulled by dread. When the time wears its ripe face, Sayori said, you will not be permitted to step aside. It will ask for a price, and then it will tell you its number. Her tone did not move. It held the kindness of someone telling a traveler which road stones will not turn under his feet. If you give what is wrong, the river will return. If you give what is right, the river will not speak of you again. The moon's small generosity narrowed and widened in the cloud, answering perhaps to nothing but itself. On the water it rode a thin gate that appeared, held for a few breaths, and faded. Through that gate a sliver of driftwood passed, turned once, and was gone. A far owl sent a whine of sound across the bend. The sound found no purchase on mist and laid itself along the bank, then slipped into the grass. Nobu breathed and did not wake. Sayori's face belonged to the night more than to the fire. In the half-light, her features arranged themselves as if a painter had used water rather than ink, each stroke subject to running. Yet her eyes held like knots properly tied. In them, Takeshi saw neither pity nor demand. He saw the accuracy that comes to those who stand longer than comfort recommends in rooms where vows are made and unmade silently. "Do not mistake quiet for safety," she said, almost to the willow, almost to the river stone glistening by her. "Feet, do not mistake noise for courage. The bridge you will be asked to become will not bear weight unless it is made of what you will lose." The fire sank half a finger and settled. The damp wood's last useful fibers gave their consent and folded themselves into ember. The crackle soft to a woolen sound, agreeable and without display. The river leaned its voice over the stones and helped carry hers across. The incense thinned to a memory of praise. Nobu stirred, eyes opening halfway. He looked toward the fire, saw not the room, only its warmth. He turned his face toward the river and then into the cloak again, as if choosing to sleep on the side where water speaks. The moonlight on his cheek made of him for a moment a boy in a different field, under different weather, before he had learned the sound steel makes when it enters and leaves its house. The moment passed. His breathing found a shallower pool and rested there. Takeshi inclined his head, a fraction not acceptance, not refusal, a posture that gave gravity its due without surrendering the spine. His silence to the work words would have spoiled. He allowed Sayori's sentences to arrange themselves like small stones along a path no one else would see. He did not separate command from observation. He let them share a bowl, the river. "Ahead will ask for a name," she said, the mist moving with her lips. "You will give it, and it will not be your own." A pause, thin and exact, during which the willow reached once into the current and shook silver from its fingers. "What you keep afterward will not be the same thing you keep now." The incense receded, as if remembering that it had not been invited and had lingered only on the strength of a shared past. The mist resumed its authority over edges. The moon's place closed a little and then opened again, a small courtesy to those who wished to look. Sayori lowered her hand. The smoke that had dressed her unstitched itself and returned to the fire and to the river, in equal measure. "Walk," she said, and the word barely belonged to air before it belonged to water. "Hold and let go. Pay and cross." Each line, quieter than the last until the last was almost only gesture. She turned her face toward Nobu once more, not in warning, in recognition, the way a path looks back at a traveler and knows the measure of his solace. Then her gaze came to Takeshi and stayed until staying became the same thing as leaving. When she stepped or seemed to, she did so without stirring so much as a reed. The night did not miss her. It had learned how to hold a shape until the shape decided it had been seen enough. The clearing widened by a finger where she had stood. The fire fought no wind and found none to fight. The willow laid its leaves upon one another. The river's hiss returned to its earlier mood, neither invitation nor refusal, only the ordinary commerce of stone and water. The scent of incense was not there, and yet when Takeshi drew breath through his nose, he tasted what remained of it, a sweetness that did not ask to be named. He did not speak. He did not rise to follow or to flee. He reached to the fire with 2 fingers and turned a coal so that its heat would last a little longer for the boy's sake. The coal brightened and settled obediently. He looked toward the seam of moonlight on the current and watched it travel until it slid around the bend and was replaced by another, and then another, the night's own small O's repeating themselves until they made a kind of bridge. Nobu's sleep loosened. He sighed and let go of the reed he had been holding in his dream. His hand fell open upon the cloak, and rain now, so fine that it was almost not rain, kissed his knuckles and sat there as pearls, not choosing to fall. The boy's face, smoothed by darkness, rediscovered the softness that daylight had put away. Takeshi set his palm upon the damp ground and felt the cold speak back to the heat in him. Two accuracies meeting without argument. He looked up once, at the tear in the cloud where the moon regarded the valley with its old, impartial eye. He let Sayori's words settle in him the way ash settles after work is done lightly. Everywhere, inescapable, not heavy enough to break anything heavy, enough to change color. He kept watch without counting the hours. He kept quiet without mistaking it for safety. He listened to the river, which remembered and carried, and to the boy's breathing, which remembered and stayed. When the moon closed its eye for a while, and the mist completed its curtain, the clearing became smaller, more complete. The fire's woolen crackles softened to breath. The willows ceased to offer commentary. The river, within those curtains, went on making the one sound it has always made when asked to pass the weight of days from one bank to the other. Takeshi's. Silence, older now by prophecy, sat upon the ground beside him like a bowl set ready at dawn. Sacrifice would be demanded. The night did not hurry to make it so. It held the sentence like a note sustained past comfort, past strain, into the calm on the far side where tone becomes space. Takeshi, in that space, did the only work left to him. He remained, and the river, and the thin seam of silver that returned, and the faintest fragrance of incense that pretended not to be there, together they made the room in which a vow waits for its hour without losing itself. And in that room, with Nobu sleeping and the stones listening and the willow occasionally offering a bead of water to the current, he accepted the inevitability as one accepts weather, not as fate, overtaking him, but as a horizon he would meet by walking. They crossed beyond the river while dawn was still arguing with cloud, the bank giving up its slick patience to a rise of wet earth and hushed pines. The path, barely a path at all, threaded fields where the water had lingered and made mirrors of every hoofprint, then climbed a low shoulder of hill where reeds gave way to broom and rock. Behind them, the river kept speaking in its thousand soft voices without asking to be heard. Ahead, the world remembered emptiness, no banners, no drums, only the long breath after too much noise. Word traveled even when men were tired of words. From the scattered fires of the survivors, from doorways where cloth hung in torn strips, from the backs of wagons nudged into hollows against wind, whispers moved with the weather. The mask had not been found. The leader on the wall had no name anyone could keep. Someone swore the demon mouth had tilted as if thinking. Someone else that the figure's stance belonged to a school not taught in these valleys. Bound. One rumor said without boldness, not stranger, bound. The sound slipped into rain and became only rain. They found the road where it narrowed between two black pines and passed, a shrine half swallowed by fern, its pebble path washed into a gray tongue. A bell cord hung there without bell, dropping to touch a stone that had remembered many hands. Takeshi paused long enough to take off his hat and let the mist rest on his hair. Nobu stood beside the shrine with his palms open, not praying, only letting the small stone courtyard measure his breath. Somewhere below, a crow started a sentence and decided against finishing it. By late day, with a light the color of wet paper, they came upon the temple they had not intended to find. It sat above a terrace field like a scar above a healed wound, its walls still upright where the slope held them, its roof tiles misaligned as if a careful hand had fallen asleep mid-task. The road to it had been taken back by moss and rain. A gate stood with one post leaning and the other resisting, their lintel connecting them like two brothers refusing to let go. Ivy had made of the eaves an old garment. The air near the threshold had the coolness of held breath. They entered with the same courtesy they gave to weather. Nobu's steps found the timber runner that creaked only once when asked one small sound that went ahead into the dimness and came back quieter. Takeshi's sandals whispered in the dust and ash, raising nothing worth remark. Inside, the air was colder and carried the smell time refuses to name anything but temple. Damp stone wearing its chill without apology. Old incense long gone too. Absence and yet returning grain by grain to the nose. Dry cedar that had given its sweetness to generations and discovered it still had a little left. The wind moved through broken tiles above and made a low CLM music. A hollow hum that the walls accepted and sent along without altering dot in the entry hall. A single candle squat and wide lay in a lacquered tray as if waiting. Nobu found a dry wedge among the scattered timbers and held it near the ember. He carried in a small tin a habit Takeshi had never spoken of and never corrected. The wick took heat reluctantly, then admitted flame. Their light became a small island, wavering. Gold on faded murals, soot shadows stretching and folding, the columns graying rising out of gray. On the walls, cranes painted in a hand that once had been confident swam in a lake of dust. The ink had bled to a softer persuasion, but the curve of neck and the tilt of wings still knew pride. A wash of ash had gathered at the baseboards where wind had taught itself to sweep. The floor, when Nobu moved, gave his steps back with a hollow that turned the echo into a companion. Not an intruder, they went inward, where a side corridor, roofed but wounded, offered glimpses of sky. Between each glimpse, the candle's breath fluttered. A hanging lantern, broken at one rib, swayed in a draft and knocked gently against a beam, an old, patient dialogue. Prayer slips lay in a tangle on a low shelf, their threads snarled, their ink blurred into veils and ridges, the characters more landscape now than language. Takeshi's eye noted the small order in their disorder, the way one slip had been tucked under a stone so it would not wander, as if someone had believed even abandoned prayers should not leave their place. The main hall waited as halls do when their purpose lingers longer than their keepers. The great image had been removed or burned or never placed. Only a platform remained, its surface patterned by years of kneeling and rising, the boards polished where cloth had polished them, rough where water had come and dried. Candlesticks flanked the platform like sentries who had stood their post. Through strange weather, ahead, the inner wall held what time had kept. Faint murals of waves that became mountains that became clouds. A brushwork of cranes again, this time almost invisible, as if the painter had been practicing memory. And to one side, near a pillar whose base grew a skin of moss, a patch of plaster had fallen clean to reveal stone marked by a hand. Takeshi stopped where the floor changed its mind and became stone. His gaze held the revealed place like a palm offered for inspection. Nobu stood a half step behind and left, the place that had become his answer to uncertainty. The candle's light traveled down and across, found the carved lines and sat, and them, the marks were not calligraphy and not art. They were cuts the size of thought. Some were shallow and neat, some heavier, pressed with the side of a blade as if the carver had not wished to show the instrument's edge, but could not help. It thought he knew them before he knew them. His hand rose without command and hovered, as if over a pot of tea just before lifting the lid, preparing for heat. He let his fingers rest on the stone beside the cuts, not across them. The cold moved into his skin and found the knuckles where bone remembers work. The lines did not tell a story the way men tell stories, they told a habit. 3 strokes to suggest a crane's foot, the middle stroke always slightly longer. A small hook to end the final line, a grace note made when the blade was taken away. The spacing was particular. The slight lift where another hand would have pressed was particular. The patience was particular. The way the cuts slowed at the end, refusing to taper into nothing but finishing with dignity, was particular. He had seen it only in one hand. Kazuo had carved like this in cherry wood and snow with a twig, once in the dirt behind the barracks with a finger. He had a way of making even practice an act of obligation. He never made a cut he could not. These were his, or the hand that had shaped his, had borrowed his measure perfectly. Nobu saw the change in Takeshi's face without learning it. The skin did not tighten, the mouth did not harden. Something behind the eyes laid down its burden. For a breath and picked up a different one. The boy's own breath shortened in answer and then remembered itself and lengthened. He brought the candle nearer without being asked. The flame leaned. The markings received it and gave it back in slender shadows, as if the past were waving. From under thin water dot above the cuts, someone had scratched a character small enough to be overlooked. The candle made it legible. Not a word to shout from gates, a word kept at the bottom of bowls. Endure or hold or keep depending on who spoke it and to whom. The hand that cut it had left the last stroke a fraction long, as if unwilling to put the knife away. Kazuo's last strokes were always like that, a courtesy extended to finish itself. The wind wrung its knuckles on the roof and sent dust down like a thin blessing. The candle's flame thinned, then fattened. The smell of damp stone lifted to meet the old incense and became, for a moment, like the breath of a hall waiting for evening sutras. Nobu shifted his weight, and his foot found a loose board that answered with a sound too loud for the room. He froze, then eased away, his steps learning again the shape of being careful dot and the silence thickening between the three of them. The man, the boy. The carved lines, other sounds declared themselves, a tile slipping slowly into its neighbor's lap and settling there. A spider strand letting go its bead of water. The far thin call of a night bird that had mistaken afternoon's color for its hour and corrected itself. The candle, low now, crackled softly when a droplet from the roof found the wax and made a small crater that closed at once. Everything did its work with modesty. The rumors, which had traveled ahead of them in other men's mouths, set their cups on the floor here and took seats. Bound, not stranger. A stance on the wall that remembered an old school. Etchings like reeds, a knot cut clean. An absence exactly the size of a man who had been taught to leave no noise behind. All these poured, one after another, into the space. In Takeshi's chest, where maims live with their doors shut. They asked to be fed. He gave them nothing. They stayed anyway. He touched the stone at last, not the lines. The cool between them and a memory came without being summoned. A winter morning, white across the far field, Kazuo's hand over his. On a practiced sword hilt, the weight of that hand saying what mouths spoil, the sound of sandals down a long hallway. The view of his brother's shoulder a little ahead. The understanding that to follow was not to be small, but to be correct. In the temple's fading light, those things grew large enough to stand among, then gently receded, finding their old chairs. Nobu lifted his eyes to the mural above the carved place. Cranes there had been painted, as if at the moment before choosing to rise, their wings folded within the idea of motion. Between them, a faint wash looked like fire once and water now. He had heard Sayori say burning crane in another night, a phrase that had refused to behave like omen and had sat more like a folded cloth at the edge of a table. Here the cloth seemed to have been lifted and put down again. He felt the delicate wrongness of recognizing something that might not be there. Takeshi, he said, the name allowed to move into the air like ash from a quiet stick. Then he let the name be enough. The room did not want more. Takeshi's palm left the stone and hovered a moment in the chill, then returned to his knee. He did not close his eyes. He looked at the cuts again, not to confirm, to measure himself. Against their calm, the possibility that had been shadow for so long took on a little weight. That weight did not settle like a stone. It hung like a blade's honest gravity. If the phantom's bearing had been borrowed, then the thief had studied, where only one teacher could have instructed. If not borrowed, if inherited or owned, then the truth was a road with two banks and a current that would not forgive footing taken in haste. Thread of wind found the candle and leaned it toward the carved wall. The light lengthened across the stone and turned the cuts into small gullies where shadow gathered like water. The flame struggled and then steadied. Its small smoke folded into the room's greater mist and disappeared. Nobu, feeling cold find the bones inside his forearms, pulled the cloak tighter but did not step back. His steps, when he shifted a little to let new air touch his face, made soft echoes that traveled down the hall and back with the humility of a messenger who knows the news is heavy and does not wish to be the one to carry it. On a shelf half hidden by a fallen screen stood a wooden tray with grains scattered upon it, offerings that had gone to husk. A strand of prayer beads, their cord frayed, rested in a shallow bowl of ash. He found himself straightening the strand with one finger, then left it, feeling the impropriety of arranging another man's vows. The smell of old incense seemed to attend the gesture, a faint kindness that did not belong to him. They walked the hall slowly, candle moving in front of them like a thought trying to remain unbroken. At the rear of the temple, behind a screen that leaned with the exhaustion of faithful service, a small room, open bare floor, a low writing table overturned, a stone basin with water gathered from leaks. On the inner wall, beneath a window, where tile and sky showed through in a thin strip, where scratches waited. Not many. An outline of a crane's foot, the same 3 strokes. A quiet mark cut lower, at knee height, 2 parallel lines and a closing hook, a sign they had once used to speak of returning soon, when words were not permitted. Kazuo's hand had taught that private language one evening when the world was young enough to believe that such marks could remain theirs alone. Seeing it here was like hearing his brother laugh in another room and knowing at once he would never enter this one. The wind drew a thin sound from the window's broken edge and let it go. The candlelight could not reach all the angles. Some corners kept their own night, though the day was not done. In that borrowed night, a suggestion assembled itself and refused to stand where it could be seen. Kin, rival, shadow each tried the place, and none held it. If the phantom had been a stranger, his absence would have been simple. If he had been enemy alone, the blade would have known where to strike when its hour came. Between brothers, even when one is a memory, the edge must learn a new grammar. The candle guttered once, recovered, and threw the murals into a brief shimmer, as if the cranes shifted their weight and would in the next breath lift from water to air. Nobu's eyes watered from the smoke and cooled. He did not wipe them. He let the water do its small duty of blurring. Takeshi stood with his back to the carved wall and did not lean. His spine held him as if the inscription itself had become a post. The cold in the room settled into him without malice and with the industrious certainty of weather-finding stone. He traced the edge of the low writing table with 2 fingers and found where a hand had once steadied a page there, just there. Always there, the groove was no deeper than a breath. He understood it the way farmers understand when the ground is ready and when it will only look ready. Everything in the room had become the record of hands he knew without needing to see. He had learned a lifetime how to stand in rooms where speech would make the air shatter. He stood that way now and felt the crack run through the center of him, clean and without sound. They returned to the main hall and set the candle near the carved place. Its light was weaker, its pool smaller. Outside, the sky had forgotten how to be different from stone. Wind moved through the broken tiles like a low chant. A moth brushed against the flame and circled and found the dark again. Unscorched, perhaps only because the night had asked kindly, Takeshi set his hand on the cold stone once more and kept it there. Nobu, understanding something without knowing. what it was, stepped back until his echo became a soft accompaniment rather than a repetition, and let the silence answer the questions gathering in him as a pond answers rain by taking each drop in and becoming, by degrees, something that looks the same and is not. He watched the profile of the man to whom he had given his vow, the stillness that could be read as strength, and was, underneath, a kind of listening that cost more than muscle. He felt a fear with no panic in it, the fear one feels when discovering that the road ahead passes between names that will not both fit in the mouth at once. The candle sank until its flame was lower than the edge of the lacquer tray. Wax pulled white and surrendered. The wick made a small sound of surrendering too. In that near extinction, the carvings took on a deeper authority. They no longer asked to be recognized. They simply were like weathered stone, like river, like the thin, particular way Kazuo had made even a practice stroke faithful. Wind breathed once more through broken tile, and the hull answered with an even, hollow tone. The smell of damp stone and old incense met in the middle of the room and stayed. The smell of men was only the smallest thread. Nobu's steps when he shifted were careful enough to keep their echoes small. Takeshi's hand, still on stone, relaxed finger by finger until the palm alone kept contact, as if to say, I will not claim. I will not deny. They left the candle to gutter itself into darkness. At the threshold, Takeshi glanced back once, not for direction, for measure, the way a craftsman steps back from a piece and accepts the truth that it has already chosen the hands that will complete it. The carved marks did not follow. They held the wall. Outside, the temple's eaves combed the wind. The trees beyond moved in a persuasion too, gentle to be muse. They descended the moss steps into a light thinning toward evening. The world outside seemed larger for having recognized the room's smallness. In the field below, water gathered again in the footpaths and learned the old habit of moving toward the river. Nobu walked half a step behind, the place where loyalty breathes without show and kept the questions where questions belong, which is in the chest, not the mouth. Takeshi's face, unreadable, carried the weather of a mountain where cloud and stone get along because neither tries to be the other. Rumor would travel on. It would find other fires, other doorways, other careful voices, bound, not stranger. A blade between brothers. It would change hands the way bowls do and lose some of its warmth and pick up other flavors. The truth was not invited. It would arrive when weather permitted. Night came softly across the terraces. A single reed by the path leaned to touch a pool and straightened, touching only what it could without breaking. Takeshi's silence weighed correctly. It did not crush. It settled, as stones do when water leaves them, in a shape that will last until flood. The line cut in the temple, those 3 strokes, that small hook remained beneath his palm, even after he had lifted his hand, as if the cold had taught the skin a pattern. He carried it the way men carry injuries they do not bandage, without speaking of it, with a new care in every motion. They did not hurry. The wind and the broken tiles faded behind them. The smell of damp stone gave way to earth and pine. Before the first star chose to show itself, they had reached a hollow where the ground would keep a small fire. Nobu set the ember and coaxed it, and the wood, remembering itself, joined. Takeshi sat as he always sat, his hands quiet, his gaze on nothing that could be pointed to. If the phantom on the wall had been stranger, night would feel simpler. If he had been kin, the blade would know only one grief. Between those, the steel would have to learn a new duty. They ate a little. They drank river water gone sweet with patience. The fire made its soft talk. Beyond its circle, the land kept the sound of a distant current moving in a broad, dark body toward places where names do not matter. Takeshi watched. The flame decided which wood to taste next and allowed the fracture in him to be the room both brothers could occupy at once, one gone to silt and story, one perhaps wearing a mask that turned a wall to stone. He gave that room no door and no window, only a roof the night could lay its weight upon. Sleep did not come quickly. When it did, it found Nobu first, hands still warm from the work of lighting. Takeshi remained a while longer with the heaviness. Sayori's warning had left, and the cold shape of lines cut in stone by a hand he had once followed. When at last he closed his eyes, the temple's wind still moved through him. The candle's small courage still burned low, and the blade between. Brothers unseen, undecided hung in the air like a thin white breath that the dark would not take into itself yet. Night had settled a second time, quieter than the first. It gathered along the mountain's ribs and learned the chill that rises from stone after rain. Below and behind, the river's voice thinned to a rumor, a long low murmur that slipped between boulders and conifers, and finally became only the thought of water. Mist clung to the cliff face as if the rock itself were breathing. It rose from gullies and moved across the path in slow drifts, silvered now and then by a weak moon that refused to come fully out. Wind came from the saddle and wore it clean. Edge pine resin cold, with an iron hint of wet lichen. Each gust smoothed the torch smoke into ribbons and then unstitched them. They walked the narrow path with the care of men taught by ledges. Gravel gave in small crunches beneath their sandals and slid to a stop against roots and stones elsewhere, a scattering too modest to echo. Takeshi went first, the brim of his hat beating mist into threads that dropped and vanished in the dark. Nobu followed a half step behind and left, his breath measureless at first, then winning a steady shape. Further back, at the elbow of a switchback, a few ronin came on in a thin line. Torches held low to keep the wind from taking them points of orange that found and lost themselves in fog. Fireflies too tired to rise dot the mountain's flank lifted, and turned them along a ledge where the drop went unseen and therefore larger. On one side, the rock wall carried the faint damp shine of new weather. On the other, scrub pine leaned from the slope toward the path, as if to overhear the footsteps. Branch tips brushed sleeves, wet and fine as hair. The cliff face here had learned to speak in small creaks and distant knocks, the sound of a loosened tile in a temple, now made of stone. Every so often a pebble clicked, and then there was only the wind again. Drawing its thin line between shoulders, they reached the place where the mountain, having argued with time and rain, had cut a crossroads into itself. It was not a mark men had made with tools. It was the seam where water had remembered one course and then another, where stone had yielded in two directions without giving up its dignity. A wide rock kept the path's company, its surface hollowed like a low bowl by centuries of weather. Within the hollow, a little water had gathered from mist and wind, black and still the sky's pale strip bending in it with the patience of a reed. One path fell away under hemlock, shadow down into a forest where the night sat thick on the ferns and the air smelled of old bark, wet needles, the sweet dullness of decay that returns to usefulness. The descent angled into darkness and then hid itself, leaving only the suggestion of roots and wet leaves. A thin hoot from somewhere within answered no creature in particular and fell quiet again. The other path climbed toward a shoulder of pale rock and then bent out of sight, its stones packed and smoother. The kind of road that had once hosted cartwheels and would again if men insisted. Far up that slope, a lantern's faint glow showed and hid watchfire or shepherd's light. The difference carried wages. Takeshi stopped at the bowl-shaped stone and set his weight in the middle of the crossroads as if the mountain had asked him to be its pivot. The torchlight from behind breathed and shrank, making of the mist a slow-moving wall, white where it caught the flame, gray where it kept its own counsel. The wind lifted his sleeve and put it down again, polite, He did not speak. Nobu halted beside him, not quite shoulder to shoulder, the place where questions can be heard without needing answers. He studied the two paths as if they were blades of different tempers set within the same scabbard. Downward, cover, roots, the language of owls, and the slick argument of mud, a way to vanish and perhaps to endure. Upward, exposure, the measured stones of a road that had taught horse hooves to be regular. The certainty of watchful eyes and the discipline of being seen. His breath came shallow first, then widened until it matched the wind's rhythm. The torchlight behind showed the tiny tremor along his jaw, and then withdrew its witness, the Ronin. Arriving by degrees, let their torches lean into the lee of the rock and formed a hesitant crescent, not approaching too close to the choice. Their faces were the faces of men who have spent their courage in coin smaller than glory. Smoke from damp brands wrote brief letters on the air, then dissolved them. Somewhere between breaths, one torch hissed and surrendered a spit of ember. It fell, kissed the damp hollow in the stone, and died with a sound like a pinched word. No. One called command. The mountain kept the quiet. From far below, the river shaped a long syllable and held it, as if to remind them it had not stopped its carrying. The wind, pleased with itself, tried a different angle, slid past their ears with a thread of cold, and then forgot its errand. Pine resin moved with it just enough to color the air. The night brought all its small witnesses and then allowed them to sit down. Nobu waited for his master's voice, the way a student waits for a bell that may not ring. He felt the weight of the place, the bowl of water holding the pale bend of sky, the dark fringe of forest that had room for a hole. Army's footsteps, and would remember none of them. The slope brightening by inches where stone had kept itself clean of moss. The lantern high and faint that could be a kindness or a snare. He felt also the weight of what had followed them into the mountains, Zoe's whisper that sacrifice. Is a bridge? The mask set aside in mud that counted rain with a tooth. The temple wall where a hand he knew had cut 3 strokes and a hook and left silence to finish the inscription. All of it moved within him like mist, not choosing a room. Takeshi's stillness worked a kind of language of its own. It did not say wait and did not say choose. It placed Nobu within the hour correctly and removed everything that would have made the moment easier and therefore wrong. The night took the outline of hat brim and shoulder and turned it into an emblem, the way the moon turns a fence into a poem by not trying. The path downwards breathed softly, fern against fern. A bead of water gathered at a hemlock tip and dropped without being noticed by anything that could speak of it. In the underwood, the smell of damp loam deepened and offered its plain promise. Shelter for the invisible, a slow hour, a chance for a single life to survive a wider loss. The path upward showed the clean geometry of stones and the honest exposure of an open slope. Somewhere beyond the bend, a watchman shifted his weight. The lantern's tone altered almost imperceptibly when he did, a movement heard more by stone than ear. The air there smelled of cold iron and horse sweat that had dried into leather years ago and not yet been washed out by rain. The Ronin behind shifted their feet in the gravel, the sound small and honest. One of them coughed and caught it before. It became more than a grunt. Another lowered his torch to save it from the next gust. Faces half seen in fog flickered into being, and out like thoughts a man decides not to keep. They looked to Takeshi and found exactly what they had come to depend upon. A calm that refused panic. A quiet that refused to pretend it predicted anything. Nobu's breath shallowed again, then corrected itself. He looked at the forest's mouth and felt his body say yes the way a muscle says yes to rest. He looked at the slope and felt his soul say yes the way a vow says yes when asked whether it still remembers. The two answers stood facing each other across a small pool of water where the sky bent and trembled and neither yielded. He slid his thumb along the scabbard's knot, not to loosen it, to feel cloth under skin. A human measure in the midst of stone and wind, and the old work of roads dotted the space that the mist made between thoughts. Sayori's voice returned not as apparition, as remembered cadence stitched to wind. The bridge you will be asked to become will not bear weight unless it is made of what you will lose. Whether that bridge lay in the forest's keeping or on the open road was not a riddle to be solved by cleverness. It was a matter for feet, and for time. Takeshi moved his hand and laid it upon Nobu's shoulder. The touch was firm and without instruction, a weight measured like a craftsman's pressure on a joint he has fitted and is testing for truth. It did not guide him toward tree or stone. It made of the boy's body a place where decision could stand upright. Nobu's breath hitched, then steadied. The shoulder learned the hand and did not lean into it. A lull came, the wind taking another path, the torches learning a steady burn, the Ronin settling into a half-circle of patience. In that lull, the river's far sound rose and fell like a line of sutra spoken by those who have said it too many times to remember what saying is. Gravel shifted underfoot, the foot stilled. The bowl of water in the hollow accepted a few more drops and held them without remark. If he spoke, Takeshi would have named the obvious, that the descent held safety if safety meant remaining, that the climb held honor if honor meant being seen, that both held deaths without witnesses. But words at this place would turn the mountains, work into something men can bargain with, and that would be untrue. He kept his silence, and that silence shaped the room more exactly than talk. Nobu, waiting for what might or might not come from that quiet, found himself listening instead to smaller things, the thin grit under sandal leather, the pine needles threading and unthreading each other in the wind, the tiny sound a torch makes when it accepts a gust and recovers, the river finding its seam through boulders, far off and sure. Within these, he heard his oath, no longer bright as new iron, gentler now, more like cloth, not looser, more lived in. It did not seize his feet. It set them down where he would set them if no one watched. Behind the fog, men's lives arranged themselves according to their own timid maps. A pair of Ronin exchanged place without discussing it. One turned his face to keep smoke out of his. Aizen discovered for the first time that day how badly he wanted to sleep. Another shifted his spear because he had taught his hands never to rest without object. Each small decision made no claim on the crossroads and yet added a grain to its weight. A gust came from the upper slope, colder than the last, with a memory of snow in it. It wrapped around the rock and slid under Nobu's cloak, discovering the thin sweat at his neck. He shivered once. The forest, jealous of wind it did not quite catch, responded with the creak of an unseen limb. A moth ventured out and thought better of it, returning to the fog as if it had mistaken it for a larger, safer night dot in the folds of that night. Takeshi became again the mountain had placed in the exact middle. He thought of the wall where the 3 strokes and the hook had cut stone into meaning, and of the mask counting rain by tooth, of the reed he had dropped into a river that remembers without keeping, of the warning that the next crossing would ask for a name not his. He allowed all of these to sit with him, neither sent away nor clutched. Nobu looked at his master's hand upon his shoulder and saw in it nothing theatrical. He saw only a weight that had learned exactly what it could ask of another and what it could not. He lifted his own hand and placed it on the knot at his side, feeling the cloth once more, the worn threads that had begun to polish where thumb and palm met it daily. For an instant he imagined loosening it and felt the wrongness of doing so here, where the mountain had set its question. He let the knot be. The moon, persuaded by no one, pushed a little farther through cloud and offered a paler light to the crossroads. It drew a line along the upward path where the first stone gleamed. It laid its gentler wash across the forest's teeth, making them appear less eager. In the bowl of water, the moon's curve settled and held, a crescent patient enough to be trusted, for the space of 3 breaths. Then mist took it back. The Ronin waited well. They had learned that waiting is a kind of work that doesn't look like work. One of them shifted the torch to his other hand, and flexed fingers made numb by damp. Another closed his eyes and opened them, choosing not to dream yet. An older man pinched a coal free of his brand and dropped it into the hollow of the stone. The coal hissed and went dark. A small offering to the mountain's drink. No sign appeared. No omen made itself available to men's hunger for relief. A fox barked once from the lower slope. Stone answered with its own empty tone. The night kept its discipline. The river said the one thing rivers say when they are asked to hold more than men can carry. It goes on. Nobu drew breath, and in that breath the choice rose in him with the quiet of a tide flooding a flat shore. It did not shout, and it did not hide. He felt it touch his heels, his knees, his chest. He felt it find the place the Sayori had named and stand there, not asking to be admired, only to be acknowledged. He did not look to Takeshi's face. He did not look to the torches. He looked at the space where the 2 roads left the stone and entered their separate weather, and he understood that whichever his feet learned tonight would teach his heart a different grammar. Takeshi lifted his hand from the boy's shoulder. The absence was not cold. It was permission. He let his arm fall back to his side and let the mountain make of them 2 figures in one silence. He swallowed once, not against words, against the human need to make a mark where none belongs. The wind, perhaps pleased by this, softened for a moment, and in that softening the Ronin could hear their own hearts keep a more comfortable pace. The mist pressed closer, not to obscure, to protect. The torches took on halos and made faces into softer versions of themselves. The path downward darkened by a finger's width, like a wick pinched and then released somewhere deeper under the trees. The path upward held its pale line. Far off, the lantern blinked and did not blink again. If there were scouts on the road, they breathed without knowing they had been folded into a choice not theirs to make. Nobu's mouth opened and closed. Whatever word had formed returned to breath. He let the breath out and felt it warm his fingers for an instant. The gravel under his feet steadied. He moved nothing. He stood within the question as one stands within a doorway at night, hand on. Either jam, knowing that to step through is to admit the house will be different when seen from the other side. They remained so, the man and the boy. The bowl of moon water, the forest's mouth, the slope's white stones, the weary, watchful ring of torches, the wind that knew where to go and where to leave alone, the river far below, remembering and carrying. Silence settled across the crossroads like a cloth laid over an altar, soft, exact, leading edges clean. No decision was spoken. The chapter of night did not turn its page. It held the moment until it learned the weight of both roads. In that holding, the story balanced on cloth and stone, on breath and weather, on a hand lifted and then gone, and the path ahead. Descending or climbing gathered its inevitability the way mist gathers on pine, quietly, without argument, ready to be shaken free by whatever morning chooses.